We now turn to some of the important papers, some of the most important papers of the 20 or so years that follows the death of analytic philosophy in the epistemology and metaphysics of the 50s and 60s. There are lots of choices to pick from here, but we're going to start with the work of Paul Grice. The reason we're going to start with the work of Paul Grice has to do with the underlying theme of the 20th century when it comes to analytic philosophy and the work being done in the post-analytic tradition. The analytic tradition is defined primarily in terms of the idea that the problems of philosophy can be addressed most easily and clearly through the notion of logical form, which means we can run our metaphysics through this notion and we will develop an epistemology that is also logical in character in roughly the same way that Frege's work is logical. So the notion of logical form plays an absolutely crucial role in understanding the history of analytic philosophy. That means language is essential. We start addressing philosophy problems by looking at ordinary notions of meaning and the logical form that is presented to us in sentences that have meaning in ordinary language. Once we get to where we see that the project can't work, that we can't really run all of our metaphysics and our epistemology through language in this way, the notion of meaning turns out to be a very troubling notion. The underlying project of the 20th century in the analytic tradition is a fully naturalistic one. Exactly what naturalism involves in philosophy is a debated question, and there are lots of different senses of it. But the primary idea is that respect for science and respect for its progress shows us that supernaturalism is false. That's the idea behind the work being done. So what we're trying to do is develop a scientific approach to philosophy, and that culminates in logical empiricism, the kind of view generated by the Vienna Circle and the work being done in the 1920s. Notice the limitations that it puts on metaphysical theories. It turns out, of course, that naturalism or physicalism or materialism, all of those are metaphysical positions. So if you're going to rule out all of metaphysics as nonsense, you're not going to be able to articulate the view. Nonetheless, it might be an attitude that people have that can't be put in the form of language, that some sort of naturalism is true. In any case, the primary challenges to a naturalistic tradition are the ones that come to dominate philosophy by the middle part of the 20th century. We've always had metaphysical and epistemological work that needed to be done, but what comes to be seen as troubling is the notion of mind and language itself. What is the mind that makes it be part of the natural world or makes it compatible with being part of the natural world? Descartes claimed clearly that it was not part of the natural world, and that's a view that needs to be resisted. So, working in the philosophy of mind comes to take part of the center stage in the post-analytic tradition. The other notion that takes center stage is the notion of meaning itself, semantics, and its role in the philosophy of language. What are we supposed to do with this notion of meaning, which also is a bugaboo when you're trying to give a naturalistic account of everything? Notice that when we had verificationism, logical empiricism, logical positivism taking center stage, the notion of meaning turned out to be a fundamentally epistemological notion. We clarified meaning and meaningfulness in terms of some notion having to do with what could be verified or confirmed or things like that. And then the idea is, once we had meaning replaced by confirmation, if we could get a logical theory of confirmation, we'd be home free. So it turns out logic and logical form in natural language was the central key to solving the problems in philosophy of language that threatened naturalistic philosophy, conceived of very broadly. By the time we get to the end of analytic philosophy, where verificationism and logical empiricism turns out to be a dead end that people abandoned in the 1950s, epistemology no longer holds a solution to the problems of meaning and semantics that plague naturalistic philosophy more generally. So we need a different approach. We need to say something about what meaning is, and here the work of Grice is absolutely essential. I had you read Logic and Conversation, but Grice has a theory of meaning. He has a famous paper called Meaning, which is also interesting in this regard because Grice articulates the problematic aspect of the notion of meaning for a naturalistic philosophy. Grice holds that semantic meaning arises out of speaker meaning, and speaker meaning is to be contrasted with a different sort of natural meaning of things. So clouds mean rain, Grice holds, but that's a kind of natural meaning. Notice it's easy to take clouds to be an epistemological signal that it's gonna rain or that rain is more likely than it would have been otherwise or something like that. So natural meaning here can be given an epistemological account, it seems. In any case, Grice said there's a different kind of meaning. Semantic meaning arises out of speaker meaning, which is a kind of non-natural meaning. The terminology here is absolutely central. When you call something a non-natural phenomenon, you know that the naturalists are going to take umbrage immediately with the description of the phenomenon in question. In any case, we get a Gricean program where non-natural meaning is explained. It's a complex theory and we don't need to look at it, but it's explained in terms of speaker meaning, where speaker meaning is a matter of the intentions, or at least is partly a matter of the intentions of the speaker. What is the speaker trying to do? Now notice here then that the problems for naturalism that arise from the nature of this kind of semantic meaning generate a further problem of trying to explain how the nature of the mind is compatible with the non-naturalism in question. So maybe one way to think about the Gricean program is that non-natural meaning looked like it was going to be a problem for naturalistic philosophy broadly construed, but maybe there's some hope because if we explain non-natural meaning in terms of language about intentions and the like, if we can solve the problem for naturalism arising in the philosophy of mind, we will have reduced the problem of language to the problem of mind, and maybe there's an escape route so that naturalism can be defended. That's an interesting proposal, and we'll look at some other philosophy of mind kinds of issues when we get to Putnam and Lewis. But let's look at the other side of Grice's program. So Grice first has, as part of his program, characterizing the notion of semantic content in terms of speaker meaning. But the other side of the Gricean program is to defend a certain Russellian view about what conditionality involves, what implications hold, in terms of a distinction between the semantics and the pragmatics of conversational theory. So Logic in Conversation starts out in a rather surprising way. It says there are these paradoxes for material implication, and Grice claims, I'm going to defend Russell's account of the truth conditions for standard conditionals by giving a general theory of conversational implicature. What sorts of information we convey to each other when we speak, so that there is stuff that gets conveyed, information that gets transferred, but doesn't get transferred in virtue of the semantic content of what is being said. So let's talk a little bit about these implicative relationships that Grice holds to be central to his theory of communication. So one way to think about, here's a first example, but before I talk about Smith has very good handwriting in a letter of recommendation, note that this paper would have been better sold as a paper that talks about the general theory of communication and offers a general theory of communication with certain nice benefits for solving certain other kinds of problems in the philosophy of language as something that you can derive from the theory. It is not primarily a paper aimed at the problem of material implication, the paradox of material implication. That's just one of the side effects of the general theory that's been being developed here. You don't really need a general theory of the sort Grice is proposing if all you're trying to do is solve this one little problem. So that's not what Grice is up to, but he undersells the project by putting it in the form of this paradox of material implication. But it turns out that's not the only benefit to the theory. We get a general account of how communication works so that semantics plays one part of it, but pragmatics comes to play a much, much more significant role than was acknowledged before. So here's some examples. Smith has very good handwriting in a letter of recommendation. That's a damning sentence to find in a letter of recommendation. Bill and Mary married and had a child versus Bill and Mary had a child and married. This is a good example of a case where and doesn't satisfy the usual constraints that and satisfies when we do logic. So notice, if you have a conjunction in logic, A and B, you can replace that with B and A. The order of the conjuncts makes no difference, either in the cases of conjunctions or disjunctions. A or B has the same truth conditions as B or A. A and B has the same truth conditions as B and A. And yet, the information conveyed by these two sentences is quite different. The second one suggests or communicates or conveys the information that they had a child before they got married. The first one conveys the information that they got married and had a child after they got married. If you paint my house, I'll give you $100. What does that communicate? What about when you don't paint the house? Well, this is the particular paradox of material implication. The paradox of material implication is that this sentence is true whenever the antecedent is false. And so you get strange implications that Grice documents in the paper that you read. Here's a nicer one. I watched Notre Dame beat USC and shouted for joy. This conjunction conveys a causal relation between the two conjuncts. But the sentence itself, just treated in terms of the usual semantics of and, suggests no such thing. Finally, you can't go to the party unless you clean your room. That conveys the information to my daughter that if she cleans her room, she can go to the party. But notice that it doesn't say that. In case you're having a hard time seeing that, note that unless means if not. So what it says is, if you don't clean up your room, you can't go to the party. And it doesn't follow from that that if you clean your room, you get to go to the party. That's why the word unless in any formal legal document is a very scary word for people who are signing the document. Be very careful if you ever have a contract that has the word unless in it, that you're replacing it with if not and not following the conversational implication of if you satisfy the clause after the word unless, you get to deny the negation that precedes it. So Grice aims to try to explain and understand this notion of conversational implicature, which doesn't involve semantic explanations. The semantics does not explain what gets communicated in those sorts of cases. So Grice says The pragmatic principle governing conversation is fundamentally the cooperative principle. Make sure your conversational contribution such as is required at the state in which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. Then he claims that this cooperative principle has certain corollaries. So I guess the idea here is you're supposed to be able to derive these other claims from the cooperative principle. It's not obvious how you're supposed to do that, but he claims we should be able to do that kind of derivation. So the first corollary is the maximum of strength. Make your contribution as informative and only as informative as is required. So if somebody asks you if you have jumper cables because their battery is dead and you think it's probably your alternator that needs to be replaced, but you need to get your car to the shop, you should answer yes or no whether you have such a pair of jumper cables. You don't need to go into all you know about how combustion engines work and the role of the alternator as opposed to the generator, supposing you know all of that stuff. That's stuff that you could say, but it's way more information that's needed. So your contribution needs to be informative as is required, but no more. Second, the maxim of truthfulness. Don't say what you believe to be false. Third, the maxim of evidence. Don't say that for which you lack adequate evidence. Now notice these two maxims are epistemic in character, in some sense. Don't say what you believe to be false or that for which you don't have adequate evidence. Maybe we could put the two together by saying, don't say things that you don't know to be true. That may be stronger than truthfulness plus evidence combined, but it's a very natural use of the language of knowledge. Don't say what you don't know to be true seems like a complaint that's a quite natural one to make if somebody misleads you in some way. Finally, be relevant. And of course, that's always true. If somebody says something to you about the last election, you don't need to talk about the American Revolution to have an appropriate response. Finally, avoid ambiguity and be brief. Now, I'm not sure exactly how the derivations of all of these are supposed to go. So you start with the cooperative principle as your axiom, and you're supposed to be able to derive each of these. It's not obvious to me how that's supposed to go, but let's grant that there is a derivability here. The work Grice wants to do involves appeal to these corollaries to explain this notion of conversational implication. Notice the central feature of conversational implications as opposed to semantic ones. Conversational implicatures are supposed to be cancelable. So take the first one. In the letter of recommendation, you write, John Smith has good handwriting. Now you could cancel the implication, the implicature, that you don't really think very much of John Smith by saying that, by just canceling it. He has good handwriting, but I don't mean to suggest he's not also a good philosopher. You could say such a thing. So conversational implicatures are cancelable. Semantic implications, by contrast, are clearly not cancelable. You can't say, John Smith is a bachelor, but I don't mean to imply that he's an unmarried male. To say such a thing makes no sense at all, because the implication from bachelor to unmarried male is a semantic one. So semantic implications are not cancelable. What makes conversational implicatures different, Grice holds, is that they are cancelable. So how do the principles cited that are derived from the cooperation principle work together to explain implications which are cancelable and hence fall under the conversational implicatures that Grice wants us to understand. So here's the way the explanations go. The speaker has said that P. There is no reason to suppose that he's not observing the maxims, or at least the cooperative principle. He could not be doing this unless he thought that Q. He knows and knows that I know that he knows, that I can see that the supposition that he thinks that Q is required. He has done nothing to stop me thinking that Q. Therefore, he intends me to think, or is at least willing to allow me to think that. And so he has implicated that Q. So let's use two of the examples. Start with the one about he has good handwriting. The idea is I am observing the maxims. I wrote that John Smith has good handwriting. I couldn't be, in this case, observing the maxims unless I thought that John Smith isn't really a very good candidate for the position he's applying for. I couldn't do what I'm doing unless I thought that Q, provided I am following the cooperative principle. And then Grice says, I, the author of this sentence, know, and know that Grice knows that I know, that I can see that the supposition that I think he's not a good candidate is required. He has done nothing. Yes, I have done nothing. I haven't canceled the implication in question. So I haven't done anything to stop my audience from thinking that Smith isn't a very good candidate. Therefore, I intend my audience to think, or at least I'm willing to allow my audience to think that. And so I have implicated he's not a very good candidate for your position. That's the form of a standard Gricean explanation from logic and conversation. What about the you can't go? So my daughter comes down the stairs, wants to go to the party, and I say you can't go to the party unless you clean up your room. She goes up, cleans up her room, comes down to go to the party. Now, I didn't say she could go to the party if she cleaned up her room, but notice if I was observing the maxims, then unless I thought that if you cleaned your room, you could go to the party, I wouldn't be engaging in the kind of cooperative enterprise that conversation involves. And I know that she knows that I can see the supposition that Q is required. So she sees that I must be thinking that if she cleans her room, she can go to the party. Otherwise, I wouldn't be cooperating with her in the conversation. And I have done nothing to stop her from thinking that if she cleans her room, she can go to the party. So I've implicated she can go to the party if she cleans her room. That's the way Gricean explanations work. And notice all of them have the cancelability aspect built into the explanation. The implication is cancelable, but it hasn't been canceled. And that's a crucial feature of the implication being a standing one. Here's the fundamental problem, though, with the Gricean story. A Gricean explanation involves two stages, a negative one and a positive one. The negative stage involves recognizing that what the speaker meant diverges from what the sentence means, because what the sentence means is a matter of semantics. So the implication in question has to arise from something having to do with what the speaker meant to communicate or convey, rather than what the sentence means in terms of its semantic content. So the negative stage involves recognizing this divergence. The positive stage involves a kind of calculation. You now know that something was meant by the speaker that goes beyond the semantic content, but then we need a positive story about how to calculate what the speaker actually meant. How is that part of the story supposed to go? The problem for the Gricean account is that the negative stage is really obvious, but the positive stage is ad hoc's the wrong word, post hoc. It arises after the fact. So in the examples, that we use, we already know what the speaker meaning is. And we generate a story as to how this meaning was calculated. But a good theory shouldn't require us to know already what the speaker meaning is. It should allow us to predict speaker meaning rather than merely construct a post hoc explanation after we already know what the speaker meaning is. That's the fundamental problem with the Gricean story. It's the second stage. We need something to tell us how to do the calculation without already knowing what the speaker meaning is. Grice also introduces in this paper a third category, which he calls conventional implication. And this third category, conventional implications, are supposed to be neither conversational nor semantic. The difference is, according to Grice, that this third category is not cancelable, but it's not semantic either. If there is such a third category, it's controversial whether there is. We need some clear guidelines as to how to recognize it. So here are some supposed examples. I'm not claiming that they're compelling or anything, but they're the kind of thing that I think Grice is after. He's a continental philosopher, but he's readable. And then so there's an implication here that continental philosophers aren't really very readable, even though there's just a conjunction term here. But then you try to cancel it. Don't get me wrong, though. I don't mean to contrast readability and that kind of philosophy. So a Gricean story here says, look, there isn't a semantic implication between being a continental philosopher and being unreadable or difficult to read. But notice the attempt to cancel the implication of unreadability doesn't really work here. You say he's a continental philosopher, but he's readable. Don't get me wrong, though. I don't mean to contrast readability and that kind of philosophy. The attempted cancellation rings hollow. Nobody will believe it. It's not like you can't go to the party unless you clean your room, but I don't mean to say that cleaning your room is the only thing you need to do in order to be able to go to the party. That makes perfect sense, so I cancel the implication. But in this case, the attempt to cancel fails. That's what Grice wants us to notice about this kind of an example. It is neither semantic, maybe it's epistemic in some sense, but it's not semantic. Nonetheless, it's not cancelable. Maybe that's a good example. So here's another one. Alex is a philosopher and his best friend is smart too. But don't get me wrong, I don't mean to imply that Alex is smart. That cancellation doesn't follow. You can't do it. It doesn't make any sense at all. The question is this one really a non-semantic implication? It relies on the use of the word too. Notice as well, there's supposed to be an implication between being a philosopher and being smart. And y'all need to stop laughing right now, because this just is not funny. But let's suppose that's the implication we're talking about. Try to cancel it. Alex is a philosopher and his best friend is smart too, but I don't mean to imply that you have to be smart to be a philosopher. That one too sounds hollow. It sounds like maybe you're taking back what you started with rather than letting it stand. So maybe that's another example. Grice, however, has a certain kind of truly ignominious example. So his example is this one. He's an Englishman, therefore he's brave. Now try to cancel the implication here between being an Englishman and being brave. Can you do it? He's an Englishman, therefore he's brave. But I don't mean to imply that being an Englishman makes you brave. Maybe the example works, but here's what Grice writes about it. And this is why the example is ignominious. While I have said that he is an Englishman and said that he is brave, I do not want to say that I have said that it follows from his being an Englishman that he's brave. No, I haven't said that it follows. He used the word therefore. I have no idea how to treat the word therefore in the example in any way other than that it follows from his being an Englishman that he's brave. I'm not sure what Grice is thinking here. So let me try to make something up. Maybe this is supposed to be a kind of non-first order logical connection. Maybe this is supposed to be an epistemic connection of some sort. In logic, when we talk about this, we say if the connection from P to Q guarantees the truth of the second given the truth of the first, the logic in which we characterize this connection between premises and conclusions is a non-monotonic logic. If, however, P offers support for Q in a way that isn't truth guaranteeing but maybe probability enhancing, then we call this a non-monotonic logic. So maybe the word therefore in Grice's example is ambiguous between a logical notion and, well, let me put it more carefully, ambiguous between a monotonic and a non-monotonic logical connection, where the monotonic connection is the only one that can be interpreted in the correct sense of following that would make it be semantic. So this would have to be semantic and therefore monotonic in order for the connection here between being an Englishman and being brave to be a semantic connection. That may be what Grice is after, and he just didn't have the terminology that we're used to using now to make the point. So maybe it's an apparently ignominious example, but revealing an important fact that the connection being asserted here between being an Englishman and being brave isn't semantic, because it's not really an entailment that's being asserted, but rather some kind of epistemic support, where we can use the word therefore to draw a legitimate conclusion from a premise to a conclusion, but it's not a semantic one. So maybe conventional implications are a kind of epistemic implication, as are conversational ones, and the crucial difference between the two is sometimes epistemic connections are non-cancelable, and other times they are cancelable. In any case, that's all we need to talk about the Gricean program and the logic and conversation paper that I had you read. I had you read logic and conversation rather than the meaning paper, because even though the meaning paper is more central to the problem of language that's faced by naturalistic philosophy in the 20th century, logic and conversation had a greater impact in the literature that follows, because it introduces this distinction between semantic content and pragmatic content that is still theorized about today. People keep trying to develop this distinction and use it to figure out what language is doing, how it works, how it functions. And part of the reason language is so fascinating here is because it generates one of the two strongest immediate concerns for naturalistic philosophy. How are we going to explain how language works in a way that's compatible with a full-blown naturalism in philosophy? So both mind and language turn out to be dominant. Prior to, say, post-World War I philosophy, the central concerns were metaphysical and epistemological, and they are addressed through the notion of logical form, both in the work of, let's see, Russell and Wittgenstein, but also in Frege and G.E. Moore. So you get a strong metaphysics and epistemology flavor, even though philosophy of language comes into being in the work of Frege, especially in On Sense and Reference. So we get the importance of language early on, but it comes to take center stage when we get logical positivism and logical empiricism in the story. And then once that view dies out, it turns out mind and language comes to take center stage in philosophy done in the analytic tradition. And Grice's work is absolutely central to the origins of some of the projects that are undertaken under the rubrics of philosophy of mind and philosophy of language.